Welcome to Legends and Lore, the podcast where we dive deep into the shadows of history, uncovering the stories that both haunt and fascinate us. I'm your host, David Culpepper, and today we're stepping into the dark, twisted tale of one of America's most infamous figures, H. Holmes, the man often called the first documented serial killer in U.S. history. Holmes's name has become synonymous with cunning, cruelty, and, of course, the chilling legend of his so-called murder castle. Now, when you hear the phrase murder castle, your imagination probably runs wild: hidden doors, secret passageways, and rooms designed for sinister purposes. And honestly, it's not far off. Holmes built what might be one of the most infamous buildings in American history, a hotel he used as both a trap and a tomb for his unsuspecting victims. But this story is about more than just a creepy building. It's about the man behind it, charming, intelligent, and utterly ruthless conman who took advantage of the chaos of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair to commit crimes that still send shivers down our spines. Holmes's story is one of contradictions. On the surface, he was a successful businessman, a skilled doctor, and a family man. But beneath that polished exterior was a man capable of unimaginable cruelty, a predator who thrived in the anonymity of a bustling, rapidly growing city. It's a story that forces us to confront the darker sides of human nature and reminds us that evil often wears a friendly face. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to unpack the layers of this disturbing tale. We'll explore Holmes's early life and how he honed his skills in deception and manipulation. We'll step inside the infamous murder castle and hear the chilling details of how he lured his victims. And finally, we'll examine his capture, trial, and the legacy he left behind. A legacy that's as much myth as it is reality. But before we dive in, I want you to think about this. What kind of person could plan and execute crimes on this scale, hiding his true nature in plain sight? And how much of his story do we really know? And how much has been shaped by sensationalism? These are the questions we'll wrestle with as we unravel the tale of H. Holmes, the devil in Chicago. To truly understand the mind of H. Holmes, we need to trace his story back to the beginning, long before he became the name whispered in the shadows of Chicago's dark history. Holmes, born Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861, grew up in the small, quiet town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. At first glance, his upbringing seemed ordinary, almost too ordinary for someone who would later commit such extraordinary crimes. But if you dig a little deeper, cracks begin to show. Holmes's father, Levi, was a farmer and an alcoholic, known for his strict discipline and harsh parenting. His mother, Theodate, was devoutly religious, often instilling in her children a sense of fear and moral rigidity. This kind of upbringing wasn't unusual for the time, but for Hermann, it may have planted seeds of rebellion or even resentment against authority and morality. Childhood friends described him as intelligent and eager to learn, but also distant, with an unsettling curiosity about death and the human body. Now, here's where the lines between fact and legend start to blur. Some accounts claim that as a child, Holmes was bullied by his peers, particularly after a group of boys allegedly forced him to confront a human skeleton in a local doctor's office. Instead of being frightened, the story goes, young Herman became fascinated, even obsessed with the skeleton. Whether this event actually happened or is just part of the myth that's grown around Holmes, it paints a striking image of a boy drawn to the macabre. As he grew older, Holmes's intelligence opened doors for him. He excelled academically and eventually earned a spot at the University of Michigan's medical school, one of the most prestigious institutions of its kind at the time. But even here, his darker tendencies began to emerge. Holmes wasn't just learning anatomy, he was finding ways to profit from it. He allegedly stole cadavers from the university and used them in elaborate insurance fraud schemes, faking deaths to collect payouts. It was cold, calculated, and disturbingly innovative, traits that would come to define his later crimes. Keep in mind, this was a time when forensics were almost non-existent, and a person could easily reinvent themselves by simply moving to a new town. Holmes took full advantage of this. He was charming, well-dressed, and confident, someone who could win over strangers with a smile. It's no surprise that people trusted him, often to their detriment. By the time he graduated medical school, Holmes had already mastered the art of deception. After leaving Michigan, Holmes began drifting from town to town, leaving behind a trail of scams, failed marriages, and suspicions. He'd marry women, often for their dowries, and then abandon them. He took on various jobs, pharmacist, teacher, doctor, always using his charm to gain trust while hiding his true nature. But it wasn't until he arrived in Chicago in the late 1880s that Holmes's ambition truly took shape. In Chicago, Holmes found the perfect environment for someone like him. A bustling, growing city where thousands of people arrived every day looking for opportunity. It was a place where anonymity flourished, and the chaos of rapid urbanization made it easy for predators to operate unnoticed. Here, Holmes would reinvent himself once again, this time as a successful businessman and hotel owner. But beneath the polished surface, his mind was already working on something far more sinister. Holmes's story is one of transformation, how an intelligent, ambitious young man became a manipulative conman and eventually a cold-blooded killer. It's a chilling reminder of how easily charm and intelligence can mask darker intentions. And in Chicago, Holmes wouldn't just hide his crimes, he would build a monument to them, a building that would come to be known as the Murder Castle. In the late 19th century, Chicago was a city on the rise, a place of ambition, transformation, and sheer grit. By the time the 1893 World's Fair rolled around, Chicago was ready to prove itself to the world. Officially called the World's Columbian Exposition, the fair was meant to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. But really, it was Chicago's chance to shine. For 6 months, from May to October, more than 27 million people from all over the globe poured into the city, eager to see the future unfold before their eyes. Now, try to imagine what it must have been like to walk through the gates of the fair. The centerpiece was the White City, a stunning collection of neoclassical buildings, all painted a gleaming white and lit up at night by thousands of electric lights, an innovation so new that many visitors had never seen it before. The fairgrounds stretched across 600 acres, filled with exhibits showcasing the latest technologies from the Ferris wheel, a marvel of engineering that could carry over 2,000 people at once, to the moving sidewalk, an invention that hinted at the convenience of modern urban life. There were pavilions from dozens of countries, each offering a glimpse of its culture, and vendors selling everything from the first ever Cracker Jack to newfangled electrical appliances. It must have felt like stepping into a dream. But while the fair painted a dazzling picture of progress, and the reality outside its gates was far grittier. Chicago in the 1890s was a city of extremes. On one hand, it was a hub of innovation and industry. On the other, it was plagued by poverty, overcrowding, and crime. Immigrants flooded into the city, lured by the promise of work, but many found themselves crammed into tenements, working long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages. The anonymity of city life made it easy for predators to hide in plain sight, and the booming population created a constant churn of people coming and going, their absence often unnoticed. And then there was H. Holmes watching all of this unfold and seeing not a city in turmoil, but an opportunity. Holmes had established himself in Chicago as a charming and successful businessman, operating a drugstore and building what he called a hotel just a few miles from the fairgrounds. To the average passerby, it looked like a respectable establishment, nothing out of the ordinary. But behind its brick facade lay something far darker. Holmes was a master manipulator, and the World's Fair provided him with a near-endless supply of potential victims. He targeted those who were most vulnerable. Young women arriving in the city alone, searching for work or a fresh start. He would offer them jobs at his drugstore or positions within his hotel, often using his charm and good looks to gain their trust. To visitors from out of town, he'd promise affordable lodging in his hotel, a tempting offer for those overwhelmed by the chaos and expense of the fair. And once they stepped through his doors, they were at his mercy. Think about it. In a city so large and transient, who would notice if someone disappeared? Families back home might assume their letters had been lost in the mail, or that their loved ones had simply moved on to another opportunity. Holmes exploited this anonymity with chilling efficiency. The World's Fair, a symbol of progress and innovation, became his perfect hunting ground. It's chilling to think that while millions of people marveled at the wonders of the fair, a man like Holmes was lurking in the shadows, turning the hopes and dreams of his victims into his own twisted game. His story reminds us that even in the brightest of places, darkness can thrive. The building that would later be known as the Murder Castle started out as just another construction project in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood. In 1887, H. Holmes purchased a lot at the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street. At the time, it seemed like a smart business move. Holmes, already operating a drugstore nearby, claimed he wanted to build a multi-use property, a place with retail spaces on the ground floor and apartments or hotel rooms above. On paper, it was a respectable venture. But what Holmes had in mind was something far more sinister. From the very beginning, the construction of the castle was shrouded in secrecy. Holmes hired and fired multiple contractors, often refusing to pay them for their work. He claimed this was to cut costs, but the real reason was far more calculated. By constantly switching builders, he ensured that no one had a full understanding of the building's layout or its more unusual features. Trapdoors, hidden staircases, sealed rooms. These were not the kinds of things you wanted your average contractor asking questions about. Holmes orchestrated the entire project like a conductor leading a symphony, but instead of music, he was composing a house of horrors. When the building was completed, it was a 3-story structure with a labyrinth of rooms, hallways, and passages. The ground floor housed retail spaces, including Holmes's drugstore, which gave the building an air of legitimacy. But it was the upper floors that held the real secrets. Imagine walking into what you think is a standard hotel, only to find yourself in a maze where every turn seems designed to confuse, or worse, trap you. Some rooms were soundproofed, with thick walls that ensured no one would hear screams. Others were equipped with gas pipes that Holmes could control from a hidden panel, allowing him to asphyxiate his victims at will. There were trapdoors that opened into chutes, sending bodies tumbling directly into the basement. One room, nicknamed the Vault, was airtight, with steel walls and a heavy door that locked from the outside. It's said Holmes used this room to suffocate victims slowly, often listening to their struggles just beyond the door. The basement was perhaps the most terrifying part of all. Here, Holmes had installed a dissecting table, vats of acid, and even a crematorium. It was a place designed not just for death, but for the complete disposal of human remains. And yet, for all its horrors, the castle functioned as a seemingly ordinary building on the surface. Guests came and went, employees worked in the shops downstairs, and no one seemed to notice the dark secrets hidden behind the walls. Of course, the castle's true purpose became horrifyingly clear as people began to disappear. One of Holmes's early victims was Julia Connor, a woman who had worked at his drugstore. Julia had an affair with Holmes, but when she became pregnant, she vanished, along with her young daughter, Pearl. Then there was Emmeline Segrin, a young woman Holmes hired as his secretary. Holmes promised her marriage and a life of luxury, but instead she became one of his many victims. Another tragic case was Minnie Williams, a woman who inherited a sizable fortune. Holmes used his charm to convince her to sign over her property to him, and not long after, Minnie and her sister disappeared without a trace. These are just a few of the lives lost within the castle's walls. Holmes's victims came from all walks of life, women looking for work, travelers visiting the World's Fair, even his own employees. What's chilling is how methodical he was, selecting his victims carefully and ensuring that their disappearances went unnoticed. In a city as crowded and transient as Chicago, it was all too easy for someone to vanish without raising suspicion. The castle was a place of unimaginable horror, designed and built by a man who saw human lives as nothing more than tools for his own gain. But even the most carefully constructed plans eventually fall apart. In Holmes's case, his greed would be his undoing. And when investigators finally uncovered the truth about the murder castle, what they found was more horrifying than they could have imagined. H. Holmes might have been a master manipulator and a meticulous planner, but in the end it wasn't the horrors of the murder castle that brought him down. It was something far less sinister, an insurance scam gone wrong. It's almost ironic that a man who had successfully hidden some of the most heinous crimes of his time was ultimately undone by his own greed. In 1894, Holmes partnered with an associate named Benjamin Pitzel, a man with a family and a knack for shady dealings of his own. Together, they hatched a plan to fake Pitzel's death and collect a $10,000 insurance payout. The idea was simple. Pitzel would disappear, Holmes would provide a body to stand in for him, and the two would split the money. But as we've seen, Holmes rarely stuck to plans that left others alive. Instead, he murdered Pitzel, staging the scene to look like an accidental explosion, and collected the insurance money for himself. But Holmes's downfall didn't come from the murder. It came from the loose ends he failed to tie up. Pitzel's widow Carrie and her children were drawn into Holmes's scheme, as he promised to reunite them with their father, all the while leading them on a horrifying cross-country journey. Holmes's erratic behavior eventually caught the attention of Pinkerton detectives who had been hired to track him down. By the time he was arrested in Boston later that year, investigators had started to unravel the web of lies and crimes he'd left in his wake. When authorities began investigating the murder castle in Chicago, what they found defied imagination. The building's labyrinthine design and macabre features, trapdoors, hidden passages, and rooms equipped with gas lines, painted a horrifying picture of premeditated evil. In the basement, investigators uncovered evidence of Holmes's methods for disposing of bodies: vats of acid, a dissecting table, and bone fragments. One detective described the scene as something out of a nightmare, and the press quickly latched onto every grisly detail, dubbing Holmes the Beast of Chicago. Holmes's trial, which began in October 1895, was nothing short of a spectacle. By this point, he had confessed to a staggering 27 murders, though some historians believe the actual number could have been higher or lower, given Holmes's penchant for exaggeration and self-promotion. Throughout the trial, Holmes seemed oddly composed, often smiling and charming the courtroom. He even acted as his own attorney, cross-examining witnesses and delivering arguments with the same smooth confidence that had lured so many victims into his traps. But behind the charm was a man utterly devoid of remorse. The public was captivated by the trial, with newspapers printing sensational headlines and graphic details of the crimes. Holmes became something of a dark celebrity, a figure who seemed almost too monstrous to be real. His contradictory confessions only added to the intrigue. One day, he would claim responsibility for dozens of murders. The next, he would deny everything, blaming others for the horrors found in the castle. Whether he was playing games or simply trying to control the narrative, Holmes's behavior kept the public and the press on edge. On May 7, 1896, H. H. Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. True to form, his death wasn't without its own unsettling details. Witnesses reported that Holmes remained calm and composed right up to the moment of his execution, and while hanging was a relatively quick method of execution for most, Holmes's neck didn't break immediately. Instead, he reportedly dangled for nearly 15 minutes before finally succumbing. It was a strange, almost poetic end for a man whose life had been defined by cruelty and manipulation. Holmes's story didn't die with him, though. If anything, it became larger than life. His crimes were dissected in books, newspapers, and eventually documentaries and films. The murder castle itself became the stuff of legend, even though it was later torn down. And to this day, historians and true crime enthusiasts continue to debate the extent of his crimes and the true nature of the man behind them. Was he a criminal mastermind or just an opportunistic conman with a streak of violence? One thing is certain: H. H. Holmes left an indelible mark on history, one that continues to fascinate and terrify us over a century later. The story of H. H. Holmes and his so-called murder castle has fascinated people for over a century, evolving from a grim historical tale into something almost mythic. But as with any story that's been retold countless times, the line between fact and fiction has become increasingly blurred. While the true horror of Holmes's crimes is undeniable, some of the more sensational aspects of his story owe as much to creative license as they do to reality. Much of what we think we know about Holmes comes from the way his story has been portrayed in books, films, and documentaries. Take the murder castle, for instance. Popular accounts often describe it as a sprawling, almost cartoonishly evil structure, complete with rooms that doubled as gas chambers, acid pits in the basement, and trapdoors leading to endless chutes. While the castle certainly had its sinister features, historians who've studied the original plans suggest that some of these descriptions are exaggerations or outright fabrications, likely fueled by the sensational journalism of the time. One of the biggest hurdles for historians trying to uncover the truth about Holmes is the lack of reliable records. Many of the details about his crimes come from his own accounts, confessions that were often contradictory and riddled with embellishments. At one point, Holmes claimed to have killed 27 people, but even that number fluctuated depending on his mood or his audience. Some investigators at the time suspected the true number could be as high as 200, but that figure was more speculation than evidence. What makes this even more complicated is that Holmes had every incentive to exaggerate his crimes. By playing into his own legend, he ensured that he would remain in the public eye even after his death. And let's face it, Holmes understood the power of a good story. The more monstrous he appeared, the more people wanted to read about him, talk about him, and remember him. Even the identities of his victims are shrouded in uncertainty. While we know about some of the people Holmes is confirmed to have killed, like Julia Connor and Emmeline Segren, many of the others he claimed responsibility for have no records or evidence to support their deaths. In some cases, investigators found that the supposed victims were still alive, having simply left Chicago or lost touch with their families. It's a stark reminder that while Holmes was undoubtedly a murderer, the scope of his crimes might not be as vast as legend suggests. And then there's the castle itself, which was torn down in the early 1900s, further complicating efforts to separate fact from fiction. Without the building, many of the claims about its design and purpose are impossible to verify. What we do know, however, is chilling enough. The soundproof rooms, the gas lines, and the basement designed for disposing of bodies all paint a picture of a man who thought of murder as a methodical, almost industrial process. In more recent years, Holmes's story has been reimagined in countless ways. Books like The Devil in the White City have brought his crimes to a new generation, blending fact with fiction to create a compelling narrative. And while these portrayals have certainly kept his story alive, they've also contributed to the legend, adding layers of drama that make it harder to uncover the historical truth. Documentaries, films, and podcasts have followed suit, each adding their own spin to the tale. In the end, Holmes's story is as much about the power of storytelling as it is about the man himself. The facts are terrifying on their own, but it's the way his crimes have been mythologized that keeps people fascinated. We may never know the full truth about H. Holmes, how many people he killed, how his castle was truly designed, or what drove him to commit such horrific acts. But what's clear is that his legacy, shaped by fact and fiction alike, continues to haunt our collective imagination. H. Holmes may have been executed over a century ago, but his story has never truly faded. In fact, it's only grown larger, woven into the fabric of American folklore and true crime. From books to films to podcasts like this one, Holmes has become a symbol of something much bigger than his own crimes, a figure who represents both the darkest corners of human nature and the stories we tell to understand them. One of the most well-known works inspired by Holmes's story is Erik Larson's The Devil in the White City. Part true crime, part historical drama, the book masterfully juxtaposes the grandeur of the 1893 World's Fair with the horrors of Holmes's crimes. It brought his story to a new generation, blending meticulous research with the kind of narrative flair that makes it feel almost like fiction. It's no surprise that Hollywood came calling. For years, there have been talks of adapting the book into a film or series, with Leonardo DiCaprio attached to play Holmes. The idea of seeing this story brought to life on screen is as chilling as it is intriguing. But Holmes's influence isn't limited to his own story. He helped shape what we now recognize as the charming serial killer archetype in media. Think about characters like Hannibal Lecter or Norman Bates, figures who are intelligent, charismatic, and utterly terrifying. Holmes was one of the first real-life examples of this kind of figure, a man who used his charm and intellect, not just to commit his crimes, but to evade suspicion. It's this unsettling duality that makes him such a compelling and deeply disturbing character in the collective imagination. So why do we keep coming back to stories like this? Why does H. Holmes, in particular, continue to fascinate us? Part of it is the sheer audacity of his crimes. The idea that someone could construct an entire building designed to deceive and kill is almost too horrifying to believe. And then there's the setting. Chicago, a city bursting with opportunity and anonymity, where the lines between progress and danger were often blurred. Holmes's story taps into a primal fear, the idea that beneath the surface of even the most dazzling achievements, darkness can lurk. There's also something about the contrast in Holmes himself that keeps us intrigued. He wasn't a shadowy figure hiding in the woods. He was polished, successful, and completely at home in society. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears a smile, shakes your hand, and offers you a place to stay. Ultimately, Holmes's legacy is as much about the stories we tell as it is about the crimes he committed. His name has become shorthand for a certain kind of evil, cold, calculated, and hidden in plain sight. And while we may never know the full truth of his actions, his story will undoubtedly continue to captivate, horrify, and remind us of the thin line between progress and peril. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the dark and twisted tale of H. Holmes. His story is one of stark contrasts, a man who presented himself as charming and successful, yet concealed a horrifying capacity for manipulation and murder. It's a reminder of how deceptive appearances can be, and how evil can thrive in the most unexpected places. Holmes wasn't some shadowy figure hiding in the darkness. He was out in the open, blending seamlessly into society. And perhaps that's what makes his story so haunting. Even now, more than a century later, Holmes leaves us with unanswered questions. How many lives did he truly take? Were there more victims we'll never know about, their stories lost to time? And what drove him to such unimaginable acts? Was it greed, power, or something deeper, something darker? These are mysteries we may never solve, and perhaps that's part of why his story continues to captivate us. It's not just about the facts. It's about the shadows they leave behind, the spaces where our imaginations fill in the blanks. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. It's not an easy story to hear, but it's an important one. A reminder of the thin line between brilliance and cruelty, progress and peril. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review or sharing it with someone who loves a good mystery. Your support helps keep this podcast going, and it means so much. Next time on Legends and Lore, we'll be trading the dark streets of Chicago for the mysterious skies of Arizona. In 1997, thousands of people witnessed something they couldn't explain, a phenomenon now known as the Phoenix Lights. Was it a UFO, a secret military operation, or something even stranger? Join me as we unravel one of the most famous mass UFO sightings in modern history. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most unsettling mysteries aren't hidden in the shadows. They're right in front of us, hiding in plain sight. This has been Legends and Lore, and I'm David Culpepper. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next chapter.